Noah Whitlock, a brilliant night mechanic, is fired by Harrington Meridian Air CEO Audrey Harrington after refusing to approve an aircraft he believes is not fully safe before a crucial buyout inspection. Hours later, auditors discover the airline's entire fleet of 22 aircraft has passed inspection only because Noah secretly repaired and maintained them through months of budget cuts while management ignored his warnings. Veteran Captain Ethan Pike and other employees reveal Noah's quiet dedication, while Noah's meticulous records expose COO Graham Hollis for hiding safety reports, taking credit for Noah's work, and conspiring with investor Sterling Blackwell to manipulate the airline's value for a hostile takeover. Audrey realizes she was deceived by falsified reports and publicly suspends the buyout, removes Graham, and reinstates Noah to lead an independent safety audit. She overhauls the airline's culture by protecting mechanics who raise safety concerns and separating maintenance decisions from financial pressure. Graham and Blackwell's scheme collapses. Victor Harrington loses his influence and the airline emerges smaller but stronger and safer. Noah is appointed director of flight safety operations, while remaining the humble father whose integrity saved countless lives, proving that an airline's greatest strength lies not in executives or investors, but in the honest people who quietly keep every aircraft safe to fly. "So who fixed all 22 of these planes?" Audrey Harrington asked, her voice carrying across the freezing hangar like an order that expected no delay. In front of her stood a fleet that had just passed an emergency inspection, and behind her waited billionaire Sterling Blackwell Penn, already warming in his pocket for the buyout. No one answered right away. The pilots looked at the concrete. The technicians looked at each other. Then Ethan Pike, the senior captain, slowly raised his hand toward the hangar door. "The man you just fired, ma'am." Audrey turned, and there was Noah Whitlock walking out in silence. If you love the kind of reversal that leaves an entire hangar breathless, subscribe and stay with this story to the very end. The main hangar of Harrington Meridian Air smelled of jet fuel, cold metal, and the faint burnt coffee bitterness that clung to every early morning shift. It was not yet 7, and the enormous doors had been rolled halfway open to let the gray Kentucky dawn spill across the polished floor. 22 aircraft sat in perfect rose wings, gleaming under the high sodium lamps, nose gear aligned as though someone had measured each one with a ruler. To an outsider, it looked like a fleet at the peak of health, a company with nothing to hide. To the woman standing at the center of it all, it looked like the most important morning of her life. Audrey Harrington had barely slept. At 35, she carried the weight of 3 generations of her family on shoulders that had never once been allowed to slump. Today, the inspection team from Blackwell Crown Capital would walk her fleet, examine her log books, and decide whether Harrington Meridian Air was worth the investment that would keep it alive. If the aircraft passed, Sterling Blackwell would sign, the board would quiet down, and she would keep the chair her father kept, reminding her she had not truly earned. If they failed, the airline her grandfather had built out of 2 crop dusters would slip through her fingers before her 40th birthday. She smoothed the front of her charcoal blazer and told herself, as she had told herself 100 times that week, that failure was not on the schedule. The inspection team arrived in a cluster of dark coats and tablets led by a quiet auditor named Harold Vance, who had spent 30 years finding the small lie inside the large report. Sterling Blackwell walked a half-step behind him, silver-haired and unhurried, smiling the way a man smiles when he already knows how a meeting will end. Beside Audrey stood Graham Hollis, her chief operating officer, a broad man with a firm handshake and an answer for everything, holding a leather binder against his chest like a shield. Graham had assured her a dozen times that the fleet was ready. This morning, watching the auditors fan out among the aircraft, she chose to believe him one more time. What happened over the next hour was not what Audrey expected. She had braced herself for delays, for a maintenance flag on the older regional jets, for the auditors to frown at the hydraulic history that Graham's reports had always described as manageable. Instead, Harold Vance moved from tail to tail with a growing quietness that unsettled her more than any complaint could have. The hydraulic systems were sound. The brakes had been rebuilt. The auxiliary power units, which the internal reports had called the fleet's weakest point, had all been serviced within the last 2 weeks. Every logbook was current, every discrepancy closed out, every signature line filled. It was, Vance murmured to no one in particular, the cleanest fleet inspection he had walked in years. Audrey should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt a cold thread of confusion tighten in her chest because none of this matched the reports that landed on her desk. For 6 months, those reports had told the story of a fleet held together by patience and prayer of deferred parts and stretched schedules and a maintenance department, always one crisis away from grounding half the aircraft. She had signed off on budget cuts based on those numbers. She had trimmed the technical staff based on those numbers. Now she stood in front of 22 planes that looked as though money had never been a problem at all, and she could not reconcile the two truths standing in the same room. She turned to Graham and asked quietly at first who had done all of this. Graham's smile flickered. He said the operations team had made a tremendous push, that everyone had pulled together, that this was the result of the culture he had built. It was a smooth answer, the kind he was good at, but it did not survive contact with the auditors. Harold Vance looked up from a logbook and said mildly that the depth of the work suggested a single experienced hand, not a committee. He wanted to know whose hand. And Audrey, feeling Sterling Blackwell's patient eyes on the back of her neck, feeling the whole delicate morning tilt beneath her, raised her voice so it filled the hangar. Who fixed all 22 planes? The silence that followed was total. Somewhere a compressor hissed and went quiet. The technicians gathered near the tool cages did not move. The pilots standing beside their aircraft studied their own boots. Audrey looked from face to face and saw something she did not understand at first. Something that looked almost like fear. And beneath the fear, something that looked like shame, that did not belong to any of them. She was about to ask again louder when Captain Ethan Pike stepped forward from the line. Ethan was 61 gray at the temples, with the unhurried certainty of a man who had landed aircraft in weather that made younger pilots pray. He had flown for Harrington Meridian Air for 29 years, longer than Audrey had been alive. He did not look at Graham. He did not look at Sterling. He looked straight at the CEO. And then he lifted one weathered hand and pointed toward the far end of the hangar, toward the personnel door, where a lone figure in a faded work jacket was carrying a battered tool bag out into the cold. "The man you just fired, ma'am," Ethan said. For a moment, Audrey did not move. The name arrived in her mind before her memory could catch up to it. Noah Whitlock, the night mechanic, the difficult one. The one Graham had warned her about, the one she had dismissed 3 hours earlier for refusing a direct order in front of the whole crew. She turned toward the door in time to see him pause just for a breath, as though he had heard his own story being told behind him. He did not turn around. He did not come back to claim what was his. He simply pushed the door open and stepped through it, leaving behind 22 aircraft that he alone had kept fit to fly. Sterling Blackwell watched all of this with the interest of a man who had just spotted a crack in a wall he intended to buy. He said nothing, but the corner of his mouth curved, and in that small movement Audrey felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She had walked into that hangar believing she understood her company. She was beginning to suspect she understood almost nothing at all. 3 hours earlier, before the auditors, before the question that would freeze the hangar, Noah Whitlock had been finishing the last inspection of the night. The building had been nearly empty, then lit only by the work lamps clamped to his rolling cart and the green glow of a diagnostic laptop balanced on a wing panel. He had worked through the night as he had worked through so many nights before, moving from aircraft to aircraft with the quiet economy of a man who had done this 10,000 times and still refused to rush a single step. He was 40 years old, lean and unhurried, with grease worked so deep into the creases of his hands that no soap had removed it in years. The last aircraft on his list was a regional jet with a fuel pressure sensor that had been reading intermittently. A fault too small to ground a plane on a normal week and too real to ignore on a week when that plane was about to be paraded in front of investors. Noah had chased the fault for 2 nights. He suspected the sensor itself, but he could not yet rule out a wiring harness that had been chafing against a bracket. And until he could, he would not put his name on a document that called the aircraft ready. He wrote it up cleanly, plainly, the way he wrote everything, and he requested that the jet be held back 1 more day for a deeper check. Graham Hollis had not taken the request well. He had come down to the hangar at 3:30 in the morning, coat over pajamas, and told Noah that pulling 1 aircraft from the lineup would break the picture of 22 ready jets that the whole buyout depended on. Noah had listened, wiped his hands, and said what he always said, which was that a maintenance report was not a decoration and could not be edited to please a man with a checkbook. Graham had called him difficult. Noah had not argued the point. He rarely argued anything. He simply did not move. That was when Audrey arrived, summoned by a text from Graham that described a disgruntled mechanic sabotaging the inspection timeline out of spite. She came into the hangar tired and tense and unwilling to lose the morning to a labor dispute, and she found a soft-spoken man in a work jacket refusing to sign a form. Graham framed it exactly as he had framed it in the message. Noah was bitter. He was slow. He did not grasp the pressures of a company fighting for its survival. And Audrey, who had never spent a full shift on that floor, who knew Noah only as a name in a personnel file that Graham had flagged as a problem, believed him. She ordered Noah to sign the final approval. He declined. He told her without heat that no one had the right to turn a technical record into scenery for an investor, and that if the company wanted 22 ready aircraft, it needed 22 aircraft that were actually ready, not 22 that had been declared ready by Penn. In front of the assembled night crew, in front of Graham's carefully arranged version of events, it sounded like insubordination. Audrey heard a man defying her authority on the most important morning of her career, and she made the decision fast, the way her father had taught her to make decisions look strong. A single mechanic does not get to bring an entire airline to a stop, she said. Noah did not beg. He did not raise his voice. He reached up, unclipped his employee badge from his jacket, and set it gently on the workbench between them. An airline only needs one person brave enough to say no, he said, so the whole sky doesn't have to pay for the yes. Then he gathered his tools while security waited by the door, and he left the hangar without looking back. Behind him, unseen, Graham Hollis slid the honest report out of the active file and tucked it into a side folder where the truth could rest quietly until it was too late to matter. The house Noah drove home to was small and old, tucked at the edge of a shuttered airfield outside a Kentucky town that had been busy once and was quiet now. The porch light was still on. Inside on the refrigerator hung a crayon drawing of an airplane with a stick figure standing under it, and the words, "My dad fixes the sky," written in a 9-year-old's careful hand. Noah had looked at that drawing every morning for 2 years, and every morning it reminded him why he had chosen the night shift, why he had walked away from a career that had paid twice as much. His daughter Clara was the reason for all of it. After his wife had died, Noah had made a quiet arrangement with his own life. He would work the hours no one else wanted so that his days could belong to a little girl who had already lost one parent and could not afford to feel she had half of another. He had been an engine certification engineer once at a major carrier, respected, well-paid, on a track toward the kind of office that came with a view. He had given it up without regret to stand under fluorescent lights at 3:00 in the morning, listening to turbines, the way other men listened to music because a night mechanic could be home when the school bus came. That morning before the hangar erupted, his phone had buzzed on the workbench. It was Clara, awake too early, asking in her small, serious voice whether he would be home for dinner. Noah had leaned against a wing and told her yes, he would try and that everything was fine, keeping his tone light, and even so she would hear nothing of the storm gathering around him. He had not told her he had just lost his job. He had learned long ago that a father's job was to carry the weather, so his child could stay in the sun. He told her he loved her, told her to eat something before school, and slipped the phone back into his pocket as security appeared at the far door. Among the matisks of 3 states, Noah Whitlock's name was spoken with a particular kind of respect. He could stand beside a running engine and name the failing bearing by its sound alone. He could read a logbook faster than most men read a newspaper. And he carried the maintenance history of all 22 Harrington aircraft in his head the way other people carried the birthdays of their family. He did not brag about any of it. He seemed almost embarrassed when younger technicians asked him to explain what he had heard or seen. He simply knew, and he used what he knew to keep airplanes in the sky and keep the people inside them safe. For 6 months, as Harrington Meridian Air spiraled through its financial crisis, that knowledge had been the only thing standing between the fleet and disaster. The company had cut maintenance spending to make its quarterly numbers look survivable. Parts were deferred, inspections were stretched. The technical department was asked to do more with fewer hands every month, and Noah had answered the shortfall the only way he knew how, by staying long after his shift ended, night after night, fixing what needed fixing, documenting what he could. Holding the line one aircraft at a time so that no pilot would ever climb into a cockpit wondering if the plane beneath him had been signed off by pressure instead of proof. He never took extra pay for the extra hours. Graham always said the company was struggling, that everyone had to sacrifice, and Noah accepted it because he had never done the work for money. He asked for exactly one thing in return, the same thing every time: that no aircraft be forced into the air before it was truly safe. It was not a large request. It cost the company nothing but honesty, and it was in the end the one thing the company was no longer willing to give him. Noah did not think of himself as a hero. The word would have embarrassed him. He was simply a father who understood better than most that every passenger strapped into every seat was somebody's reason to keep the porch light on. When he tightened a fitting to the exact torque, when he refused to close out a fault, he could not fully explain. He was not thinking about the company or the buyout or his own reputation. He was thinking about a stranger somewhere with a daughter of their own waiting at a gate expecting the person on that airplane to come home. That was the whole of his philosophy, and it had never once let him down. In the drawer of his workbench, and now in the tool bag over his shoulder, Noah kept a personal notebook worn soft at the corners that no one at the company had ever thought to ask about. Inside it, in his small, even handwriting, was the true history of the fleet. Every one of the 22 aircraft. Every fault. He had found the date and hour he had found it. The part he had replaced the name of the pilot or technician who had witnessed the work. And beside many entries, a note of the warning he had sent to Graham and the silence he had received in return. It was not a diary. It was a record, and a record Noah had learned across a lifetime of machines was the one thing a lie could never fully erase. Audrey Harrington was not whatever the morning would make her look like a cruel woman. She was intelligent and driven and genuinely afraid of failing a family that had never made room for failure. She had grown up in a house where love was measured in results, where her father Victor discussed the airline at the dinner table, the way other fathers discussed the weather, and where a Harrington who lost the company would be remembered for nothing else. She had taken the CEO chair believing that if she was disciplined enough, decisive enough, precise enough with her numbers, she could save what 3 generations had built. Her mistake was not malice. Her mistake was that she had learned to see the company only from above as a spreadsheet, a projection, a set of reports handed up by men she had chosen to trust. Her father called her almost every day, and every call carried the same pressure. If the deal with Sterling Blackwell collapsed, Victor reminded her the Harrington family would lose control of the airline after 3 generations, and she would be the one whose name was attached to the loss. He told her to look strong. He told her that investors smelled weakness the way sharks smelled blood. He told her, without ever quite saying it, that the truth was a luxury a company in trouble could not always afford. And Audrey, wanting so badly to be the daughter who saved rather than the daughter who lost, hardened herself in exactly the ways that made her easiest to deceive. Graham Hollis understood all of this better than Audrey did, and he used it with the patience of a man who had planned his moves far in advance. He fed her reports that made the technical department look chronically difficult, and Noah looked like the most difficult of all. He described maintenance as a bottomless pit of complaints, a drag on the company's future, a place where old men slowed down progress. What he never told her was that he had been the one to gut the maintenance budget in the first place to make the short-term profit line look healthy, and that he had then quietly taken Noah's repairs and folded them into operations reports so the company would appear stable to any buyer who came looking. Sterling Blackwell had arrived in the middle of this, like a rescue that too many people were too tired to question. He spoke a vision of expansion of new aircraft and renovated lounges and a Harrington Meridian Air restored to the prominence it had lost. Audrey wanted to believe him because believing him was easier than the alternative. But in the sealed folders of Blackwell Crown Capital, the real plan wore a colder shape. Sterling did not want to grow the airline. He wanted to buy it cheaply, strip the aircraft that still held value and keep the true prize, which was the route authority and the acres of land wrapped around the airport, worth far more emptied than flown. Audrey did not know she was being maneuvered by 3 men at once, by Graham beneath her, by her father, behind her, by Sterling across the table from her. She knew only that she could not afford to look weak. And so when Graham told her a mechanic was sabotaging the inspection, she did the strong thing, the decisive thing, and cut him loose without a second thought. She believed she had removed an obstacle. She did not yet understand that she had just fired the only person in the building who knew what her fleet actually was, or that within 3 hours those same aircraft would force her to ask the one question she least wanted answered. Back in the present. In the ringing quiet after Ethan Pike had pointed toward the door, Audrey tried to regain control of the room, She turned to the assembled technicians and asked each team lead one by one to explain who had completed the work on the 22 aircraft. She expected someone to step forward and claim it because, in her experience, someone always stepped forward to claim credit. Instead, she got a wall of careful silence because every man and woman on that floor knew exactly whose work it was, and not one of them was willing to lie to her face about it. Not with the auditors listening and the truth finally out in the open air. It was Ethan Pike who broke the silence a second time. He was too old and had seen too much to be afraid of a young CEO or a billionaire in a good coat. He told her plainly that for months, whenever a pilot wrote up a fault, Graham had found a reason to defer it, and Noah had found a way to fix it before the next departure. He told her about a landing in bad weather the previous winter, a flight that should never have been dispatched, saved because Noah had stayed after his shift on his own time to correct a brake problem no report had ever officially acknowledged. Half the aircraft in that hangar, Ethan said, would have been grounded long ago if Noah Whitlock had done only what the company paid him to do. A young technician named Mason Reed found his own courage then. He was barely 25, still nervous around senior people, but he could not stand to hear the silence swallow the truth. He said that Noah had taught the entire night crew how to properly inspect the brake assemblies on the older aircraft techniques that were not in any company manual, and that without those lessons, at least 8 of the jets sitting in that hangar would have been out of service months ago. He said Noah never once put his own name forward, never asked for thanks, and that everyone on the floor had simply grown used to being quietly saved by the man who worked the shift. No one watched. Graham tried to cut in. He said Noah had merely followed company procedure, that any competent mechanic would have done the same, that the operations team deserved the credit for the results. Ethan Pike turned and looked at him with an expression that was almost gentle in its contempt. "No," the old captain said. "The company forgot about us. Noah kept us alive." The words landed in the hangar like a dropped wrench on concrete, and no one, not even Graham, tried to pick them back up. The humiliation of it was public and precise, and it unfolded directly in front of Sterling Blackwell, who missed none of it. Audrey had fired Noah believing he was wrecking her schedule out of spite. Now, one after another, the people who actually kept her airplanes flying were telling her that he was the single reason she had a fleet to show at all. She felt the certainty she had walked in with drain out of her and something colder take its place. A suspicion that she had been managed, that the reports she had trusted had been written to lead her exactly here. She ordered someone to call Noah back. Security reported that he had already left the employee lot. Graham, sensing the ground moving, suggested they simply continue the inspection and credit the operations department that there was no need to complicate a good result with personnel drama. But Harold Vance, the lead auditor, had grown quiet in a new way, and he asked to see the original technical signatures on the logbooks, the raw entries, not the summaries. That request changed everything. The logbooks, when Vance examined them closely, showed the marks of editing. The official summaries credited the operations department for the fleet's condition clean and corporate and reassuring. But buried in the deep technical annotations in the layers where a busy executive never looked, Vance found a recurring personal code, an identifier a specific mechanic used to sign his most detailed work. It appeared again and again on aircraft after aircraft beneath entries that someone had tried to reassign. It was Noah's code threaded invisibly through the entire fleet, and no amount of summary editing had reached down far enough to remove it. Audrey stared at the evidence and understood with a slow sinking certainty that she had not merely fired the wrong man. She had possibly just driven out the only person who knew the whole truth about her airplanes on the exact morning she needed that truth most. The question she had shouted across the hangar had come back around and pointed itself at her, and its real target was not the mechanic at all. It was the CEO who had run a company for 2 years without ever once knowing who was keeping it in the air. Noah did not go far. He drove to a small diner near the airport, a place with cracked vinyl booths and a coffee pot that never seemed to empty, where he had sat after so many night shifts to write in his notebook while the sky turned from black to gray. He ordered eggs he did not especially want and opened the worn pages out of habit more than plan. His phone rang once Clara again, and he told her softly that Dad was fine, that he would see her soon, keeping her carefully outside the thing that was happening to his life. Then he closed the phone and let the diner's quiet settle over him. Ethan Pike found him there an hour later. The old captain slid into the booth across from him, ordered coffee, and told Noah bluntly what had happened after he walked out. how the whole hangar had turned toward the door, how the auditors had found his code in the logbooks. He warned Noah that Graham would not go down quietly, that the operations chief would try to shift every deferred repair, every technical failure onto the shoulders of the mechanic he had just fired. If Noah stayed away, Ethan said he would be the perfect person to blame. Noah listened without much expression. He said he had no interest in going back to beg for a job he had already lost. But when Ethan pressed, he agreed to one thing. He would meet Audrey Harrington on the condition that the meeting be recorded officially and that an independent flight safety representative be present. He would not walk back into a room where the truth could be edited again the moment he left it. Ethan nodded because it was exactly the kind of condition a careful man would set, and exactly the kind that told him Noah was thinking not about revenge, but about proof. Then Noah turned the notebook around on the sticky diner table and let Ethan see what was inside. The old captain went still as he read. Page after page in that small, even hand lay the entire hidden history of the fleet. Dates and times of repairs, part numbers, serial numbers, the names of pilots who had witnessed the work, small photographs tucked between the pages showing cracked fittings and corroded brackets, copies of emails sent to Graham and marked in Graham's own replies as not urgent. It was not the notebook of an angry man. It was the notebook of a witness who had known somehow that a day like this would come. The most damning part was the last section. Noah had kept copies of 22 original maintenance reports, the real ones, the ones that named him as the mechanic who had performed the work. He had watched over the months as Graham took those repairs, erased his name from the official records, and used the cleaned-up numbers to make the company look healthy to a buyer. He had said nothing publicly because a mechanic accusing a chief operating officer of fraud was a mechanic looking for the door. But he had kept every page, every timestamp, every photograph waiting for the moment when the truth would be worth more than his job. Audrey met Noah that afternoon in a small technical office off the hangar floor with a recorder running and a gray-suited independent safety officer named Diane Alcott sitting quietly at the end of the table. Audrey came in wearing the last of her authority like armor, and she opened with a challenge asking why, if things were as bad as he claimed, he had never brought any of it directly to her. It was meant to put him on his heels. It did not. Noah answered without any drama at all. He said he had sent 17 separate safety warnings up through the company's internal system over the past 6 months, every one of them logged with a date and a tracking number, and that everyone had been intercepted, delayed, or flagged by Graham Hollis as not urgent before it could ever reach her desk. He slid a printed list across the table. The tracking numbers were real. The dates were real. The pattern was undeniable. Audrey looked at 17 attempts to tell her the truth. Each one strangled before it could climb high enough for her to hear it. And for a long moment she could not speak at all. She had believed she was a CEO who knew her company. She was learning in a small cold office that smelled of solvent and paper that her company had an entire lower floor of truth she had never once looked down into. The reports she trusted had been a curated surface. Beneath them, in the notebook of a man she had fired that morning, lay everything she had needed to know and had never been allowed to see. Noah closed the notebook and set it on the table between them. "You wanted to know who fixed 22 planes?" he said quietly. "The better question is who let them stay broken for so long." He did not say it as an accusation. He said it the way he said everything, as a plain description of a fault that needed finding. And Audrey, hearing it, felt the last of her certainty give way, replaced by the first true question she had asked in 2 years about the company she thought she ran. She began that same afternoon to pull the buyout agreement apart line by line. She could not do it alone. So she brought in Daphne Monroe, the airline's own legal counsel, a sharp and careful woman who had raised private concerns about the Blackwell deal for weeks and been overruled each time by the pressure to close. Daphne read the contract again with fresh eyes, and this time she found the clause that mattered, tucked deep in the language about post-closing adjustments. It allowed Blackwell Crown Capital to reduce the purchase price if any discrepancy in the maintenance records came to light after the signing. The implication was chilling once Audrey understood it. Sterling was not afraid of the hidden faults in the fleet. He was counting on them. He wanted the company to sign first, believing itself saved, and then he would use the very defects Graham had concealed to force the price down or seize control outright. The deal that looked like a rescue was designed as a trap, and the bait was Audrey's desperation to look strong for her father and her board. Noah walked Daphne and Audrey through the fleet as it truly stood. He explained that the 22 aircraft were not all badly damaged. That much was honest, but that many of them were flying on the temporary strength of a maintenance team holding the line with sweat and overtime. If the company kept concealing the real condition instead of repairing it properly, the costs would not stay hidden. Within a few months, they would erupt, and by then, Blackwell would own the leverage to name any price he liked. Honesty now was expensive. Concealment now was fatal, only slower. Sterling appeared in the conference room as the mood turned against him and tried smoothly to steer it back. He said Noah was a fired employee with an obvious motive for revenge, a bitter man whose word could not be trusted. Graham backed him instantly, insisting that Noah had performed unauthorized repairs simply to make himself seem indispensable. It was a coordinated dismissal delivered by two men used to being believed. But Noah did not defend himself with feeling. He answered with photographs of the parts with serial numbers with order codes with the emails Graham had ignored, and every piece of it matched the current condition of a specific aircraft that anyone could walk out and touch. Audrey watched Sterling through all of it and saw him clearly for the first time. A man who truly wanted to save an airline would have asked about safety, about passengers, about how to fix what was broken. Sterling asked none of those things. He asked how much salvage value the fleet still held, how quickly the older aircraft could be sold, what the land was worth if the routes were consolidated. Every question he raised confirmed what Daphne had begun to suspect, and what Noah had known all along. And then Daphne found the last piece. Digging through the transaction records, she discovered that Graham had already sent the true maintenance reports, the honest ones, directly to Blackwell Crown Capital weeks earlier. Sterling had known the real condition of the fleet the entire time. He had let Audrey believe she was hiding a weakness from him, while he was in fact holding that weakness in his hand, waiting for her signature to turn it into a weapon. The rescue had never been real. It had been a slow, patient theft, dressed in a good suit and a reassuring smile. Audrey called an emergency meeting of the board that evening in the glass-walled room that overlooked the hangar floor where the 22 aircraft sat waiting in their rows. Victor Harrington was there, and Sterling Blackwell and Graham Hollis and Daphne Monroe and Ethan Pike and Noah Whitlock, still in his work jacket among the tailored coats. Below them, through the glass, the fleet glowed under the lamps like a promise no one in that room had fully kept. Victor opened by appealing to blood. He told his daughter to protect the family name, to not let a fired mechanic wreck the deal that would save 3 generations of work. Graham followed his lead, proposing that they assign the blame to the technical department, dismiss a few more people to demonstrate accountability, and proceed with the Blackwell signing as planned. Sterling added his own gentle pressure, saying that if Audrey signed that very day, he would be willing to overlook a few operational irregularities. It sounded like generosity. It was the closing of the trap, because the moment she signed, those same irregularities would become his to wield. Then Audrey asked Noah to present, and the room changed. He used no rhetoric. He simply put the fleet on the screen, all 22 aircraft, and beside each one, he laid the record, the fault, the date it was found, the warning that was ignored, the repair that was done off the clock. One after another, the airplanes became silent witnesses, and the glass room grew very quiet as the pattern assembled itself in front of people who had spent months pretending it did not exist. Ethan Pike stood and confirmed it from the cockpit side, describing the fault reports pilots had filed directly with Graham that had gone nowhere. Mason Reed and 2 other technicians brought up from the floor confirmed it from the hangar side, testifying that Noah had been the one quietly keeping the fleet airworthy while the company looked the other way. And then Daphne Monroe delivered the blow that broke the meeting open. She produced evidence that Graham had been receiving consulting payments from a firm tied to Blackwell Crown Capital, that his job had been to make the company look just healthy enough to sign and just troubled enough for Blackwell to squeeze afterward. Graham lunged for the only defense he had left. He said Noah had worked outside the process, outside the rules, a rogue mechanic doing whatever he pleased. Noah met it with the same calm he had carried through the entire day. "I worked outside the hours," he said. "I never worked outside the law." It was a simple sentence, and it ended Graham's argument completely because everyone in the room could see which of the 2 men had been protecting the company and which had been selling it. The choice fell to Audrey, and everyone in the glass room knew it. If she protected the family and the deal, Noah would become the scapegoat and the theft would proceed under a veneer of order. If she chose the truth, She would have to stand in front of her father, her board, and a billionaire, and admit that she had fired the one man who had saved her fleet. She rose from her chair. She looked at Victor, at Sterling, at Graham, and at the 22 aircraft glowing beyond the glass. Then she spoke in a voice that did not shake. "The Blackwell deal is suspended. Graham Hollis is suspended pending investigation, and Noah Whitlock will lead an independent safety audit of every aircraft in this fleet." The days that followed were not a clean victory. Suspending the deal threw the company into open crisis. Questions swirled about why the Blackwell agreement had collapsed at the last moment, and the answers the company could give were incomplete and unflattering. The board split into factions. Victor Harrington was furious that his daughter had let a night mechanic reshape a billion-dollar strategy, and he told her so in words that would have crushed the Audrey of a month earlier. She did not crumble, but she did not pretend it was easy either. Audrey was not forgiven quickly, and she did not expect to be. She had to walk down into the hangar herself, onto the floor she had always viewed from behind glass, and stand among the technicians she had treated for 2 years as names on a payroll. No one welcomed her. The silence of the crew was heavier than any speech of protest could have been. She had signed the cuts that overworked them, believed the reports that erased them, and fired the man who protected them. And they were not going to hand back their trust, because she had finally arrived in person. She stood in that silence and let it teach her something the reports never had. Noah was reinstated, but he refused to simply return to what he had been. He told Audrey that he would not come back unless the company changed the process that had failed in the first place. And he laid out 3 conditions. First, every safety report would go directly to an independent department, never again routed through operations or any financial manager who might find it inconvenient. Second, any mechanic would have the right to ground an aircraft for a reasonable concern without fear of losing their job. Third, all 22 aircraft would be reinspected in the open publicly, without reference to any of the edited reports Graham had left behind. Audrey accepted all 3. It was for her the real turning point, larger than any decision she had made in the boardroom. For the first time, she was not trying to win through authority through the strong pose her father had taught her. She was winning, if it could be called winning, by listening, by handing power to the people who actually held the safety of the fleet in their hands. It cost her the illusion that a company could be run from above. It gave her in exchange the first honest ground she had stood on since taking the chair. Late one night, after the floor had emptied, she found Noah alone by one of the regional jets running a light along a panel seam out of pure habit. She asked him the question that had been sitting in her since the hangar first fell silent. Why she wanted to know. Had he not shouted when she fired him, had not defended himself, had not made her hear the truth right there in front of everyone? Noah lowered the light and thought about it the way he thought about a fault. He told her that a man who spends his life fixing airplanes learns something about noise. Noise, he said, does not help you find the problem. When an engine is failing, you do not shout at it. You get quiet, and you listen, and you follow the smallest wrong sound down to its source. Patience finds the fault. Volume only hides it. He had not defended himself loudly because he had spent 20 years learning that the loud response is almost never the correct one, and because he trusted in the end that the record would speak when it was ready. Audrey apologized then, honestly, without the careful framing she usually put around everything she said. Noah did not rush to soften it for her. He accepted the apology, but he told her plainly that her sorry mattered less than the answer to a different question, which was whether the next person who told the truth in this company would still have a job the following morning. That, he said, was the only apology that would ever mean anything, and it was not one she could give with words. She would have to build it decision by decision over years. A few days later, Audrey stood before the assembled staff of Harrington Meridian Air and did the thing her father had spent her whole life warning her never to do. She admitted in public that she had been wrong. She said that Noah Whitlock had personally kept 22 aircraft airworthy through the worst months of the company's crisis, that the company had erased his name to protect its own image, and that it owed him not merely a thank you, but the full and open truth. She said it looking directly at the men and women on the floor. And when she finished, the silence in the hangar was for the first time not the silence of resentment. Several months later, the airline that emerged looked different from the one that had nearly been sold out from under itself. Some flights were cut so that maintenance could finally breathe. Two of the oldest aircraft were retired and sold honestly rather than flown past their limits for the sake of a number on a slide. The technical department's budget was restored, and then some, and the safety process was formally separated from every kind of financial pressure exactly as Noah had insisted. It was a smaller airline in some ways and a far sounder one. Sterling Blackwell lost his chance to buy the company at the price of its own concealed wounds. His firm quietly withdrew, and the land and roots he had truly wanted stayed with the family that had built them. Graham Hollis was placed under formal investigation for concealing the maintenance reports and accepting payments from a party to the deal, and the version of the company he had tried to sell died with his career. Victor Harrington was eased out of his honorary role after the board finally understood that his lifelong obsession with appearances had nearly destroyed the very name he was trying to protect. Audrey remained CEO, but she was no longer the woman who watched her company only from behind glass. She learned the floor. She learned the smell of hydraulic fluid and the whine of a turbine under test load and the particular grammar of a torque wrench. And she came to understand that an airline is not kept alive by speeches or by the smiles of investors, but by the hands of people who quietly do the thing correctly when no one important is watching. She still made the large decisions. She simply made them now with the floor in her lungs instead of only the spreadsheet in her eyes. Noah did not become a billionaire or a celebrated hero. He remained a plain single father who went home when he could to eat dinner with his daughter, who still worked hard, who still refused to close out a fault he could not explain. But his honor was returned to him fully. His name appeared at last in the official record, credited exactly as the truth demanded. The man who had kept 22 aircraft of Harrington Meridian Air fit to fly through the darkest stretch of the company's history. The final morning of the story was the day the first aircraft took off after the restructuring. Audrey invited the entire technical department out onto the hangar apron to watch. In front of all of them, in the pale light, she handed Noah a new employee badge. It did not read lead mechanic. It read Director of Flight Safety Operations, a role created specifically so that no report he ever filed again could be buried by anyone above him. Noah took the new badge and thanked her, but he kept the old one too. The badge he had unclipped and set on the workbench the morning he was fired, and he clipped both to his jacket side by side. Audrey noticed and asked him why he had held on to the old one. He looked at it for a moment, then looked out at the aircraft rolling toward the runway. To remember, he said, that a whole airline can lose its way just by forgetting to ask the people under the hangar what's true. The jet lifted into the dawn, climbing clean and steady into a sky that owed a great deal to a man most of the company had never noticed. Audrey stood between Noah and Ethan Pike and watched it go. This time, no one asked who had fixed it. This time, everyone in the building already knew the answer, and the knowing had changed them. Behind them, the remaining aircraft sat in their long, neat rows, no longer trophies to show a billionaire, but proof of a lesson the company had nearly paid everything to learn. An airline does not fly on the reputation of a founding family, or on $1 billion contract, or on the smile of an investor. It flies on bolts tightened to the proper torque, on reports written honestly, on people brave enough to say, "Not yet safe," even when the word might cost them their livelihood. Noah Whitlock had not saved 22 airplanes to be praised. He had done it because on every single flight there were people who needed to come home, and because a CEO can run a company, but the person who keeps it in the air is sometimes the very one she once thought she could most easily do, thou.